Let's look at one situation when organizational justice is especially important, and that concerns when there's performance measurement occurring, when we're trying to figure out how good somebody is doing their job. Let's talk about first justice and injustice. Something interesting about injustice and justice is that injustice has a greater psychological effect on people than justice. And that's due to how we're made and some of our cognitive biases. It's called loss aversion, and that is the idea that losing something seems a lot more painful than the joy that we would get from gaining it. For example, the pain of losing a $20 bill is greater than the joy of finding a $20 bill. And that's just a property of humans, because there's no limit to what we can gain, but once we die, that's the end. And so we really want to avoid the losses more than we want to get gains. So injustice is a loss, and it hits us really, really hard. And so that means that it's difficult to undo an injustice. If you're a manager and you treat an employee unfairly, even if you start treating them fairly, they're still going to probably remember that injustice, and you might not ever recover from it. But nevertheless, justice does, the more justice somebody experiences, it leads to greater feelings of being included and greater motivation. This idea of being inclusion increases, and people just really like being in a fair organization. But when there's injustice, there's retaliation, there's a loss of motivation, and it becomes really difficult to recover from that. Now let's talk about performance measurement. That's a responsibility that a lot of managers have, is that they've got to determine how well their employees are doing, so they need to measure their performance. So there's three types of performance measurement, and things can go really wrong with these things, and people can really feel that they're unjust very easily. And so managers and consultants who are advising managers need to be really careful and use a lot of wisdom when using performance measurement. Now, the three broad categories of performance measurement are, first of all, objective. That's measuring what the employee accomplishes. And typically that's quantitative. In a manufacturing job, you might look at how many widgets the employee manufactures per day on the average. Or if it's a professor, you might look at the number of papers that the professor publishes, or the ratings that he or she gets on the student evaluations. And so those are objective measures. A lot of times there's a subjective element to it, but they're numbers that are easily comparable with each other. Now another category is judgmental. And these judgmental performance measurements, these are the subjective performance ratings, typically given by supervisors, maybe given by clients or others, and perhaps along several different measures like how fast they were, how friendly they were, how cooperative they are, something like that. And so this is subjective ratings. And typically supervisors are required to give some subjective ratings each year. HR might require it in case they ever need to have evidence on why they should fire somebody, something like that. And then there's personnel measures. And that would be things that get recorded in somebody's personnel file, like the number of accidents they have at work, or their absences, or how often they've been tardy, how much sick leave they've taken, their salary and position history, when have they gotten promotion, have they been disciplined, have they gotten any awards. Those are all measures of performance in some way or another. Not very direct, but they're data that somehow is related to performance. Now we're going to look at specifically the objective and the judgmental, the subjective data. And there's some problems that occur in performance measurement, and that can be perceived of as being very unjust and a source of low organizational justice. And the main problem is that the objective and the subjective data are only weakly related. A lot of times people who do really well on objective data get low supervisor ratings, and vice versa, and the correlation isn't very strong. And that comes from both problems with objective data and especially problems from subjective data. For example, some of the problems with objective data is it might not measure all of the workers' contribution to the organization's mission. For example, if the worker is supposed to measure both widgets and thingamabobs, but only the widgets are measured, it doesn't take into consideration the thingamabobs. And maybe the worker is far better at making thingamabobs than he or she is making widgets. Or for a example, a professor, he might get good student evaluations, but he doesn't do much else in the school, and so he might have really good objective data, but his performance in other areas, which is not measured, could be really poor. And then another problem with objective data is that some of the objective data may be influenced by factors other than the employee's performance. People learn how to game the system. If thingamabobs are only measured on Thursday, somebody might learn, oh, I'm going to save some partially completed thingamabobs from Wednesday and complete them on Thursday so I can get a lot more completed on Thursday. People learn how to game the system either within the rules or outside of the rules, some type of cheating. But in any sense, the objective data isn't necessarily an accurate measure of what their actual work. Now, there are also problems with subjective data. For example, a supervisor may rate favorite employees more favorably. There's lots of humans who play favorites and don't treat everybody equally. The supervisor may be biased for or against certain demographics, and that can influence the performance ratings. The supervisor may be threatened or flattered by some individuals. So if a supervisor feels threatened by a really intelligent employee or a high-performing employee, the supervisor might think that, oh, that person could replace me, so they might rate that employee negatively so that there's to reduce the threat of being replaced. At the same time, employees often learn that flattery is incredibly effective at getting the supervisor's favor. And so individuals will flatter the supervisor to get good ratings, to get promotions, to just get better treatment by the supervisor. And studies indicate that flattery is really effective. People, if you tell a supervisor that they are just an awesome supervisor and a great human being, they are quite likely to believe you regardless of how true that is. And they're going to like you because you're extremely perceptive and intelligent also, since you've come to that conclusion from their perspective. So a lot of these problems with flattery and being threatened, maintaining and increasing their status is more important than accomplishing their organization's goals. And that makes this subjective data more a reflection of what makes the boss feel good about himself or herself, which elevates his status or protects his or her status, than how much work the employee has actually done and how well the employee has contributed to accomplishing the organization's goals. So there's a lot of problems with the objective data and with the subjective data, and when they don't match up, that especially leads to a sense of injustice. So how can we maximize justice when measuring performance? Well, keep in mind organizational justice, not just distributive and procedural, doing things in a fair way and making people get the resources distributed fairly, but also pay attention to the informational and the interpersonal aspects of justice. That people get the information, that they're always treated with respect, and that'll increase the perceptions of justice going on. Then another strategy is to emphasize performance management over once-a-year performance appraisals. Lots of us have had these once-a-year performance appraisals where the boss has to put you into one of 3 or 5 categories. And generally, most people, if they don't get the highest rating, they feel it's really unfair and they feel really discouraged. And the supervisors hate it also. Sometimes it's dictated that they can only put 20% of the people in the highest rating or a third of the people in the highest rating. And nobody likes that because maybe the employee is giving it their best and doing what they can, and the rating that they get is satisfactory because the boss can only give 20% of the people above satisfactory or something like that. So that is a big source of a sense of injustice. In contrast to these once-a-year performance appraisals, there's what's known as performance management. And with performance management, rather than just doing an appraisal once a year, supervisors work with employees regularly to set up goals unique to the worker. Not everybody has the same goals, but they're based on the worker's strengths. Their KSAs, they're known as, their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities, and goals are determined that correspond to the employee. And the employee has continual feedback on how well they're doing. The supervisor meets regularly, for example, once a week with the employee to understand what type of progress is being made on the goals. And also, and this is important, the manager, rather than just judging and evaluating, which people hate to be judged and evaluated, the manager is there to provide the help needed so that the worker can achieve the goals. And it's a joint responsibility, and the worker provides support so that the worker can achieve his or her goals. And so that's performance management, which generally goes over really well when for workers, compared to once-a-year performance appraisals, which generally go over quite poorly.